Now, when we talk about the arc of history, when we talk about the arc of history in the moral universe, and we say that it bends towards justice, it does not bend itself. So part of this course is to talk about the people who actually got us those freedoms, step by step by step. I said that when in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it wasn't exactly religious tolerance or freedom to worship. There was a theocracy with people like John Winthrop sitting there at the desk with the goatee, and Governor Dudley also sitting with them. They were Puritan ministers. They believed in their doctrine, and they were also the governors. And if you deviated from those doctrines, you could get in trouble, which is what happened to Anne Hutchinson. So she's the first person. We'll talk about it in the first lecture I do, and in the first course part that we have, the first module, will be about Anne Hutchinson and what she did to push freedom of religion. Once again, there's Homer Plessy. He's somebody else who pushed the boundary. Right here in New Orleans, you go down to Press Street where it intersects with Royal, you'll see where Plessy, Homer W. Plessy, boarded the railway train. A very light-skinned Creole, but a Creole of color, African-American. He decided to test the laws that said there were going to be segregated rail cars. And it becomes, in my mind, one of the 2 or 3 worst decisions of the US Supreme Court, Plessy v. Ferguson, in which they say you can have racial segregation. Separate but equal becomes a law of the land in the 1890s. Plessy pushed it. We'll get later. There'll be others, and we'll see who push it and get the arc of history back on course towards those things. Then you have Thom Scopes. Not only do you need to have a freedom of religion in America, you also sometimes want to have a freedom from religion. He was a biology teacher, a substitute biology teacher at a high school in Tennessee, and he wanted to teach evolution, and that was against the law. Darwin's theories of evolution, all the facts about how species evolved, you couldn't teach that in Tennessee. And so Thom Scopes decided to test that and push the law. He taught it in Tennessee, and later on in the semester, we're going to talk about the Scopes trial. And then, because Linda Brown comes along, we finally right the wrong that was done in Plessy v. Ferguson. Linda Brown, the girl in the center there, lived in Topeka, Kansas, wanted to go to a school nearest to her, but it was white. And she told her father, and her father said, we're going to have you go to that school. She wasn't allowed to enroll in the school because the case of Plessy v. Ferguson had been decided, and it was said that we could have segregated schools. Linda Brown and her father, Oliver Brown, brought this case all the way up to the Supreme Court. It becomes Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas. And they throw out Plessy, and once again, our rights move forward. Then there's Clarence Earl Gideon. He didn't really have the right to have a lawyer. We all know from watching movies and TV shows, you get arrested, they say, you have a right to a lawyer. Why do they say that to you? Because of this guy, Clarence Earl Gideon, who was basically a drifter, a pool hall hustler, a guy who was always borrowing money. And at one point, it was said he broke into a pool hall and stole some of the change from the cash register. He was tried and convicted, but he kept saying, I need a lawyer. I have the right to a lawyer. He didn't actually have a right to lawyer. Under state law, he didn't have the right to counsel. But he wrote a handwritten brief to the Supreme Court. And eventually, in the case of Gideon v. Wainwright, Clarence Earl Gideon pushed the law forward, and it was decided that you had a right to counsel. And the free press, it keeps expanding. The Pentagon Papers, done by the New York Times, the government tried to say you can't print them. It's like when President Trump tried to say you couldn't print John Bolton's book. But it was not possible for him to stop it because of the case of the U.S. versus the New York Times, in which the New York Times won the right to do the Pentagon Papers. And finally, there's Jim Obergefell. There he is on the left. He wanted to marry his partner, John Arthur. But gay marriage was not permitted. In 1993, that's where the picture was taken. That's when he started pushing it. And then by 2013, his case, too, went to the Supreme Court. As I said, these are things where we got freedoms to do things. Freedom to worship, freedom to love, freedom to marry, all because of things. There's also, of course, the notion of having economic freedoms. And that's been a little bit harder. So I'm going to end with Martin Luther King, because his speech on the March on Washington in 1963 was about the economic rights that we as a nation have to have. He had already given his I Have a Dream speech, and he had helped push forward things like civil rights, voting rights. But then he realized there was also economic rights that had to be done.
August 28, 1963. 250,000 Americans, black and white, young and old, descend on the nation's capital in a show of solidarity. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but it will be remembered as a turning point in the fight for civil rights. Among the speakers, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who electrified the crowd with the stirring I Have a Dream speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
A few months earlier, racial tensions in the Deep South had erupted. News reports carried brutal images of fire hoses blasting at the backs of school children. President Kennedy had finally seen enough. In June of 1963, he presented sweeping civil rights legislation to Congress. Dr. King and others hoped a massive yet peaceful demonstration in Washington would spur passage of the bill. The city braced for violence, but their fears proved unfounded. The day of the march, more than 200,000 people gathered for a rally at the Washington Monument. It was the largest demonstration in the country's history. Arm in arm, they walked from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, performers as diverse as Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson lent their voices to the cause. Martin Luther King Jr. was the last to take the stage. He began with a reference to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves a century earlier.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Partway through, King put aside his prepared text and shared with the protesters his dream of equal rights for all.